I've been a wedding planner for over a decade, and if there's one sentence that still makes my stomach tighten every time I hear it, it's this one. I'm paying for everything. On paper, that sentence sounds generous, supportive, almost comforting. But behind the scenes, it's often the quiet beginning of a power shift that no couple fully sees coming until it's too late. Because weddings don't just reveal love stories, they expose family hierarchies, unspoken debts, and exactly who believes money gives them the right to rewrite the day. I'm Emily Carter. I plan weddings for a living. I stand in the shadows while vows are exchanged, while music swells, while guests cry and clap and take photos. And I also see what happens just before all of that beauty begins to unravel. Tonight, I want to tell you about 3 weddings where everything seemed balanced, until the moment the event actually started. 3 mothers who paid, smiled, reassured everyone they just wanted to help, and then crossed boundaries so cleanly, so confidently, that the couples didn't even realize what had been taken from them until it was already gone. The first wedding still stays with me because nothing went wrong loudly. Nothing shattered. No one screamed. And yet, by the time the bride walked down the aisle, the ceremony no longer belonged to her. It was a lakeside estate in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Early summer, .com water, soft light, chairs arranged in clean rows facing the aisle. One of those ceremonies where everything feels deliberately peaceful, almost restrained. Victoria and Harrison had been planning this wedding for nearly a year. They were organized, respectful, and unusually calm for a couple dealing with family on both sides. Harrison's mother, Ruth, had offered early on to pay for the ceremony portion. Not the reception, just the ceremony, the venue, the chairs, the florals, the musicians. "I don't want to interfere," she told me more than once. "I just want everything to run smoothly." And to her credit, during planning, she did exactly that. No arguments about flowers, no guest list explosions, no dress opinions. She showed up to walkthroughs, nodded, asked polite questions, and deferred decisions back to the couple. It was almost too easy. The seating chart was finalized weeks in advance. Front row reserved for the bride's parents and siblings on one side, the groom's on the other, extended family behind them, friends further back, simple, traditional, balanced. On the morning of the wedding, Ruth arrived early, earlier than she needed to. Perfect hair, tailored dress, .com expression. She greeted vendors by name, complimented the setup, thanked the musicians. I remember thinking, this is going to be one of those rare days where nothing explodes. 30 minutes before the ceremony, guests began taking their seats. The sun was exactly where we wanted it. The string trio was warming up. Victoria was tucked away inside, fully dressed, breathing slowly, holding her bouquet like an anchor. That's when I noticed movement near the front rows. One of the venue attendants looked uncertain. Then, another. Chairs were being quietly shifted, not dramatically, just enough that if you weren't watching closely, you might miss it. I walked closer and saw Ruth standing there, speaking softly but firmly, gesturing toward the first 2 rows. "No, not them," she said. "They'll sit back there. These seats are reserved." Reserved. For people who weren't on the original chart, her friends, longtime acquaintances. Couples she knew from charity boards and social clubs. People who had absolutely no reason to be sitting closer than the bride's immediate family. The attendants hesitated, glancing toward me. Ruth didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply smiled and added, "I'm the one covering the ceremony." That sentence landed heavier than it should have. I intervened as calmly as I could, reminding her of the agreed seating. She nodded politely, waited until I stepped away to handle another vendor question, and then continued rearranging. By the time I realized what was happening, Victoria's parents were being ushered toward the second row. Her sister looked confused. Her father looked embarrassed, like he didn't want to cause a scene. Inside, Victoria was still waiting. She had no idea the room she was about to walk into no longer reflected the family structure she thought she'd planned. And then Ruth made her next move. She walked over to the aisle coordinator and quietly instructed them to hold the processional. "Just a moment," she said. "Some guests are still arriving." The music stopped. The guests turned. And the bride, hidden just out of sight, stood there in silence, fully dressed. Bouquet trembling slightly in her hands, waiting for permission she never thought someone else would have the power to withhold. I remember thinking, there's no way she just did this. And yet, there she was, standing at the front rearranging, not just chairs, but the emotional hierarchy of the entire ceremony. And this was only the beginning of how far she was willing to go. What struck me most in that moment wasn't the chair movement itself. I've seen seating disputes before. What unsettled me was how calmly Ruth tested how far she could go without being stopped. She didn't confront anyone directly. She didn't argue. She simply acted as if the authority had already been granted. When I pulled her aside, just a few steps away from the aisle, I lowered my voice. I told her the couple had been very clear about front row seating, that the balance mattered, that emotions were high, and this wasn't the time to adjust anything. She smiled at me, the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. "Oh, Emily," she said softly, "this really isn't a big deal. They'll still see everything. And these guests traveled so far, it would be rude not to honor them." Honor. That word again. Always used like a shield. I reminded her that the bride's parents were already seated elsewhere and visibly confused. I watched her eyes flick toward them for half a second, calculating, before she shrugged. "They didn't say anything," she replied. If it bothered them, surely they'd speak up, would they? In front of her guests? Minutes before the ceremony. With everyone watching. That's the part people underestimate. Silence in these moments isn't agreement, it's pressure. I felt that familiar drop in my stomach, the one that tells me a line has just been crossed, and the person crossing it knows exactly what they're doing. Behind the doors, Victoria shifted her weight from one foot to the other. One of the bridesmaids peeked out, whispering that the bride was asking what the delay was. Her voice wasn't angry yet, just confused, trusting. Ruth heard this too. Instead of stepping back, she stepped closer to the aisle coordinator and placed her hand lightly on their arm. "Just another minute," she said. "I'll tell you when we're ready." Ready. As if readiness belonged to her. I looked around at the guests. Some were turning in their seats, others were checking watches. The quiet that should have felt reverent felt tense instead, stretched thin by uncertainty. At that point, I had a choice to make. Push harder and risk a visible confrontation right before the bride walked. Or pause, reassess, and choose the moment carefully. I remember thinking, how many people here even realize what's happening, and how many will later say it wasn't that bad because nothing technically exploded. That's the danger of boundary tests like this. They don't look dramatic. They feel polite, reasonable, almost invisible. But once a mother realizes no one will stop her, what reason does she have to stop herself? And as the music remained silent and the bride waited unseen, Ruth glanced toward the entrance again, not with concern, but with expectation. That's when I knew this wasn't just about seating anymore. By the time I stepped back into the aisle space, the delay had gone from awkward to unmistakable. The musicians were looking at me for cues. The officiant cleared his throat, unsure whether to begin. Guests were now openly turning around, trying to see what was happening behind them. And Ruth stood there, calm as ever, watching it all unfold like this was part of the plan. I approached her again, this time with less softness in my voice. I told her the bride was waiting. I told her this pause was unnecessary and upsetting. I told her we were starting now. She exhaled slowly, like I was the one being unreasonable. "Emily," she said, tilting her head, "I've spent a lot of money making this ceremony beautiful. I think it's fair that I make sure it looks right before we begin." Looks right. I glanced toward the front rows again. Her friends were settled comfortably, chatting quietly, already acting as if they belonged there. The bride's parents sat just behind them, stiff, smiling politely at people who now blocked their view of their own daughter's wedding. If I pushed harder in that exact moment, this could turn into a scene no one would forget, and not in a good way. And Ruth knew that. That's when she made her boldest move yet. She stepped forward, closer to the aisle entrance, and lifted her hand slightly, signaling the coordinator once more to wait. Not asking, signaling. From inside, Victoria's voice finally came through, barely above a whisper, but tight with emotion. She asked if something was wrong. I felt my chest tighten. There are moments in this job where professionalism and humanity collide head-on, and this was one of them. I turned to Ruth and said quietly, "This isn't your moment. This is hers." For the first time that day, her smile faltered. Just a fraction. But then it hardened. "I'm not trying to take anything from her," she replied. "I'm just making sure everything is appropriate. People will remember this ceremony. I don't want them remembering chaos. Chaos, as if the silence, the delay, the tension wasn't already exactly that." At that point, I made the call. I signaled the musicians myself. I told the aisle coordinator we were starting immediately. No more waiting. No more adjustments. Ruth opened her mouth to protest and stopped when she realized the moment was slipping out of her control. The music began. There was no time left to rearrange the damage already done. Victoria stepped forward, finally walking toward an aisle that no longer felt like the one she had envisioned. She smiled, because brides are trained to smile through discomfort. But her eyes searched the front rows instinctively, and she noticed. I saw it in her face, that split second of confusion, followed by something heavier. Something like loss. She kept walking, she always would have. But something had been taken from her before she even reached the altar. And Ruth, she sat down, perfectly composed, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. I stood at the back, watching the ceremony proceed, knowing that even though the vows would be beautiful, the emotional imbalance had already settled into the room. The question that lingered for me was simple. If she was willing to push this far before the ceremony even began, what would she feel entitled to next? From the outside, the ceremony looked flawless. The photos would later show perfect light.com, water behind the altar, a bride glowing in white, a groom holding her hands with steady reassurance. Anyone scrolling through those images would assume nothing had gone wrong. But when you've worked enough weddings, you learn to read rooms instead of pictures. I watched the front rows closely. Victoria's parents barely moved during the ceremony. They smiled when expected to smile, clapped when the music swelled. But there was a stiffness there, a restraint that hadn't been present earlier that morning. Ruth's friends, on the other hand, leaned toward one another, whispering, reacting, fully aware of their privileged position. A few of them glanced back occasionally, scanning the room like they were checking who noticed. People always notice. After the ceremony, as guests began to stand and mingle, small conversations sparked almost immediately, quiet comments, side glances, that familiar ripple that travels faster than any official announcement. I overheard someone say, "I thought the bride's parents would be closer." Another replied, "I think his mother rearranged things last minute." No outrage, no confrontation, just recognition. That's the kind of consequence that lingers. At the cocktail hour, Victoria's mother approached me, her voice steady but tight. She didn't accuse, she didn't raise her voice. She simply asked why they hadn't been where they were supposed to be. "What do you say in that moment?" I told her the truth carefully. That changes had been made. That I tried to intervene. That the timing made it difficult. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. Then she thanked me for being honest. That reaction always hits harder than anger. Meanwhile, Ruth moved through the crowd like a gracious host, greeting guests, accepting compliments, never once acknowledging the shift she had caused. If anyone questioned it, she laughed it off. "Oh, it was just a little adjustment," she said. "Nothing worth fussing over, nothing." Except that it had quietly repositioned the emotional center of the ceremony. Except that it sent a message about who held influence and whose feelings came second. I caught Victoria watching her mother from across the lawn, not with anger, with concern. That kind of concern that comes from realizing your wedding created a wound you never intended. That's when I knew this moment would follow them, long after the chairs were stacked and the guests went home. And I couldn't help wondering how Victoria would process this later. Whether she would confront it, minimize it, or carry it quietly, unsure of when or how to address something that had been done so publicly, yet so politely. Because when consequences arrive without a scene, they tend to settle deeper. The reception didn't fix what had happened. No amount of champagne ever really does. Victoria laughed. She danced. She posed for photos with the same grace she'd carried all day. But there was a subtle shift in her energy that only people close to her would have noticed, a carefulness. Like she was moving through the night instead of fully inside it. Later, when the noise softened and guests were distracted by dessert and music, she found me near the edge of the room. Her voice was quiet, controlled. "Did something change before the ceremony?" she asked, not accusing, just asking. I told her the truth, the same way I always do when I'm asked directly. I explained the seating, the delay, the pressure. I watched her expression change in small increments, confusion, then realization, then something heavier settling in her chest. She didn't cry, that surprised me. She nodded slowly and said, "I thought I imagined it." That sentence stayed with me. Because when someone crosses a boundary cleanly enough, the person affected often doubts their own perception. They wonder if they're being sensitive, dramatic, ungrateful. Victoria stood there for a moment, absorbing the reality that her ceremony had been subtly reshaped without her consent. Then she exhaled and said something that told me everything about where this would go. She waited until I couldn't stop her. She was right. Ruth never apologized. Not that night. Not later. In her mind, nothing inappropriate had occurred. The wedding had been beautiful. The guests were impressed. The photos were stunning. Case closed. But something shifted between Victoria and her mother-in-law after that day. Not loudly, not with confrontation, just a quiet recalibration. They stopped sharing plans. Stopped inviting opinions, stopped assuming generosity meant safety. And Harrison noticed too. Weeks later, he told me they'd talked about it privately, that he'd never seen his mother assert control that way before, that it made him question how many times he'd benefited from silence without realizing who paid the emotional price. That's the kind of realization that doesn't fade quickly. As a planner, I've learned that not every boundary violation ends with a fight. Some end with distance, with awareness, with a couple deciding, silently, that access will be different from now on. And as that reception wound down, watching Victoria and Harrison hold hands just a little tighter, I couldn't help thinking about how often the most damaging moments at weddings don't happen on the dance floor. They happen quietly before the music even starts. And once you see it once, you start to recognize the pattern when it appears again in a different city, a different family, a different mother, wearing a different smile, which is exactly what happened at the next wedding. By the time I met Lily Moreno, she was already exhausted, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, disciplined way of someone who had been holding themselves together for a long time. Her wedding was scheduled at a historic hotel in San Antonio, the kind of place with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and staff trained to move like nothing ever goes wrong. On the surface, this was a dream venue, controlled, elegant, predictable. Lily needed predictable. She and Samuel had been together for years, long enough to survive grad school stress, job changes, and the slow, complicated merging of two very different families. Planning the wedding was meant to be the calm chapter, the reward. From the beginning, Lily's mother, Alice, positioned herself as a partner, not a commander, not a critic, a partner. "I just want to support you," she said often. "This is your day." And for a while, it really felt like that. Alice attended tastings without complaints. She respected the guest list. She asked before offering opinions. When Lily worried about costs, Alice stepped in with reassurance, covering part of the reception and emphasizing that there were no strings attached. That phrase again, no strings. I've learned to listen very carefully when people say that. The reception timeline was tight but elegant. Dinner, first dance, a few short pre-approved speeches, then straight into dancing. Lily was adamant about that. She didn't want the night bogged down by long toasts or emotional performances. She told me very clearly, "I don't want surprises." I promised her there wouldn't be any. All speeches were scheduled, all speakers approved, microphones controlled, or so we thought. Alice never requested a speech slot, not once. She never hinted, never asked. She complimented the couple, praised the planning, and told Lily how proud she was of her. That's what made this next part so difficult to see coming. On the wedding day, Alice was radiant. Perfect hair, soft makeup, a dress chosen carefully enough to stand out without crossing any obvious lines. She hugged guests warmly. She thanked vendors. She even stopped me at one point to say how grateful she was for my professionalism. "I don't know how you do this," she said with a smile. Weddings bring out so many emotions. I remember thinking she sounded unusually reflective. The ceremony passed beautifully. Lily glowed. Samuel cried openly, unashamed. Guests wiped their eyes. Everything unfolded exactly as planned. At the reception, the room buzzed with that early evening energy. Champagne clinks, soft laughter, anticipation. Dinner service began smoothly. The couple relaxed for the first time all day, and then, during a brief transition between courses, when the band paused and guests were settling back into their seats, Alice stood up. She didn't signal anyone. She didn't ask. She simply walked toward the microphone. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Maybe she was looking for someone. Maybe she was about to ask the band a question. But then she tapped the mic lightly, smiled at the room, and cleared her throat. The sound cut through the chatter instantly. Lily froze. I watched her expression change in real time. Confusion first, then disbelief. She turned toward me instinctively, eyes wide, searching for an explanation I didn't yet have. Alice looked out at the crowd, hands steady, posture confident, like she had been waiting for this moment all night. "I just want to say a few words," she began. A few words. I felt my stomach drop. Because when someone takes a microphone without asking, especially at a wedding where everything else has been carefully agreed upon, it's never just about words. It's about control. And standing there, watching Lily grip Samuel's hand a little tighter, I couldn't help wondering how long Alice had been planning this, and whether this speech was meant to celebrate the couple, or finally center herself. At first, Alice sounded exactly like the mother everyone expects to hear from. She talked about Lily as a child, about scraped knees and school plays, about how she always knew her daughter was strong, thoughtful, capable. The room softened. People smiled. A few guests laughed quietly at the familiar anecdotes. Lily's shoulders relaxed just a little. I remember thinking, maybe this will end quickly. Maybe she really does just want to say something kind. But then the tone shifted, not sharply, not obviously, just enough that I felt it before I could explain it. Alice began talking about difficult seasons, about how families don't always agree, about how love sometimes requires sacrifice and patience. Still vague, still safe. Then she laughed softly and said, "Anyone who knows Lily knows she has very strong boundaries." The word boundaries landed heavier than the laughter around it. Some guests chuckled, assuming it was affectionate teasing. Lily didn't laugh. She tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to signal discomfort. Alice continued, warming to her own rhythm now. "She's always known what she wants," she said, "and she's never been afraid to tell people no. Even when it's hard for a mother, there it was. A test, not of the couple, of the room. I scanned the faces of the guests. Some leaned in, others shifted in their seats. A few exchanged looks, the kind that says, "Is this getting personal?" Alice paused briefly, letting the silence work for her. Then she smiled again, softer this time. "But of course, that strength comes from somewhere," she added. "From being raised with values, from having someone who never gave up, even when things were strained." Lily's jaw tightened. Samuel squeezed her hand. At this point, interrupting would have been a social grenade. Alice hadn't crossed an obvious line yet. Everything she'd said could still be framed as loving, as proud, as maternal. That's how these moments work. The boundary isn't smashed. It's leaned on. Alice shifted her weight and glanced toward the couple, her eyes lingering on Lily just a second too long. "I want to thank myself," she said with a small laugh, "for holding this family together through the years." The room went quiet, not silent, just still. That sentence wasn't an accident. It was a marker. I felt that familiar internal question surface again. Does everyone here hear what I'm hearing? Or am I the only one counting the emotional cost of every word? Lily's expression had gone completely still now. Not embarrassed, not angry, something else. Something like being exposed. Because when a parent reframes family history in public, the child rarely has a chance to correct it without looking cruel. Alice went on, thanking relatives, mentioning past disagreements in vague terms, positioning herself as the stabilizing force that made this wedding possible. Each sentence stayed just inside the boundary of politeness. But together, they formed a narrative that wasn't about the couple at all. I glanced at the band, then at the venue manager. Everyone was waiting for a clear signal to act. And Alice, sensing the attention, straightened her posture even more. She wasn't done. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this speech wasn't spiraling. It was unfolding exactly as she intended. Alice no longer pretended the speech was light. Her voice slowed, deepened, as if she were settling into something she had rehearsed privately. The anecdotes stopped being sweet and started becoming selective. She spoke about misunderstandings that had caused distance, about how some people set limits without always understanding the hurt those limits create. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Every word landed cleanly in the quiet room. Lily stared straight ahead now, not at her mother, not at the guests, at nothing in particular. I could see the calculation happening in her mind. If she stood up, she would be labeled dramatic. If she grabbed the microphone, she would be ungrateful. If she said nothing, this narrative would stand. Alice leaned slightly closer to the mic. "There were times," she said, "when I didn't know if I would even be included in moments like this." A soft murmur rippled through the room. She let it sit there, heavy and unresolved. And yet, she continued, "Here we are. Because love means endurance. It means forgiveness. Even when it isn't acknowledged." That's when I saw Samuel's expression change. His eyes flicked toward Lily, then back to Alice, and for the first time that night, something like anger surfaced. This wasn't about gratitude anymore. It was about rewriting history in front of witnesses. Alice smiled again, this time with a fragile edge, as if she were the one exposed. "I'm so proud of you both," she said. "And I hope, as you build your marriage, you remember the people who sacrificed quietly so you could stand here today." Quiet sacrifice. The phrase echoed in the room like a verdict. I looked around at the guests. Some were visibly uncomfortable now. Arms crossed, brows furrowed. A few avoided eye contact altogether. No one laughed, no one clapped. And Alice kept going. She thanked herself again, thanked her strength, thanked her resilience, thanked her patience. The longer she spoke, the clearer it became that this speech wasn't drifting. It was claiming space, claiming credit, claiming emotional authority. I thought about all the planning meetings where she had smiled and deferred. All the moments where she had framed herself as supportive. This wasn't impulsive. This was the payoff. And standing there at the edge of the room, watching Lily endure something she never consented to in front of every person she loved. I couldn't help but wonder how many guests would walk away believing Alice's version of the story. Because once a narrative is delivered publicly, especially from a microphone, it becomes harder to undo than any seating chart. And as Alice finally paused, drawing breath for what felt like another chapter, the question wasn't whether this had gone too far. It was whether anyone would stop her and what it would cost if they did. Alice eventually stopped speaking, not because she had reached a conclusion, but because the room could no longer carry her. The applause came late, scattered, polite in the way people clap when they're unsure what exactly they're responding to. She smiled anyway, handing the microphone back like she had just offered a gift. But Lily didn't move. For a moment, she just sat there, staring ahead, her expression frozen in something that wasn't shock anymore. It was containment. The band waited, the staff waited. Everyone waited for the couple to react, because socially, this was now their responsibility to smooth over. Samuel leaned toward Lily and whispered something I couldn't hear. Whatever it was, her jaw tightened, and she nodded once. Slowly, deliberately, Lily stood up. The shift in the room was immediate. Chairs creaked, conversations died mid-sentence. Alice turned toward her daughter, clearly expecting gratitude. Maybe a hug. Maybe acknowledgement. Lily smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile meant to reassure. She took a breath, steadying herself, and spoke without the microphone, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the closest tables. "Thank you for sharing," she said. That was it. No praise, no affirmation. No validation of the narrative that had just been presented. The absence of softness was louder than any argument could have been. Alice's smile flickered. Just briefly. Long enough for anyone watching closely to catch it. Lily turned back to Samuel, sat down, and lifted her glass. The band took that as their cue and began playing again, music filling the space where tension had been left hanging. But the damage was already moving through the room. Guests whispered openly now. Some avoided Alice entirely. Others watched her with a new curiosity, as if replaying her words in their heads with different understanding. I overheard someone say, "That was a lot." Another replied, "That didn't feel like a wedding speech." Alice tried to reinsert herself into conversations, laughing a little too loudly, touching arms, telling people she was just emotional. But something had shifted. The attention she wanted had curdled into discomfort. And Lily didn't confront her. Not then, she didn't need to. The distance between them was now visible, tangible, no longer deniable. I watched Alice attempt to approach the couple once more, only to be gently intercepted by another guest, then another. Each redirection small, polite, final. That's the kind of social consequence people underestimate. No shouting, no scene, just quiet exclusion. And as Lily danced later that night, laughing with friends who surrounded her protectively, I saw Alice standing near the edge of the room, glass untouched, watching her daughter with an expression I couldn't quite name. It wasn't regret, it was disbelief. As if she couldn't understand how speaking her truth had resulted in being slowly, unmistakably sidelined. And I couldn't help wondering how this would land later, once the lights were down. The guests gone, and there was no audience left to perform for, because moments like this don't end when the music starts again, they wait. The real conversation didn't happen that night. It never does. Weddings are loud, emotional, public, they're terrible places for honesty. So Lily waited. She smiled when expected. She danced when the music swelled. She allowed the night to finish without adding another spectacle to a day that already carried too much weight. But silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. A few weeks later, Lily called me. Not about photos. Not about thank you cards. She wanted to talk about something else entirely. She told me she'd replayed the speech over and over in her head. Every sentence, every pause. every way her mother had framed the past. And what bothered her most wasn't the content, it was the intention. She wanted witnesses, Lily said. That's what it was. And she was right. Once Lily named that, the rest became clearer. The collaborative planning, the lack of warning, the decision to speak publicly instead of privately. None of it was accidental. Alice never apologized. She framed the reaction as oversensitivity, said Lily had embarrassed her by not responding warmly. Told relatives she'd simply been speaking from the heart and hadn't expected her daughter to be so cold. Cold. That word followed Lily for a while, and instead of fighting it, she did something far quieter. She stopped explaining herself. She didn't argue about the speech. She didn't defend her boundaries again. She didn't try to reframe the narrative. She just adjusted access. Calls became shorter. Visits became rarer. Conversations stayed polite and shallow. Alice was no longer invited into emotional space, only logistical one. Samuel supported her fully. He had seen the speech for what it was, and more importantly, he saw what it cost Lily to endure it. She doesn't get the microphone anymore, Lily told me. Not joking, not bitter, just certain. That's what resolution often looks like in families like this. Not closure, not reconciliation, but clarity. As a planner, I've watched countless parents mistake visibility for intimacy. They think being heard publicly equals being valued privately. It doesn't. And as Lily moved forward into her marriage, lighter in ways she hadn't expected, I couldn't help thinking about how often weddings become the stage for unresolved stories that were never meant to be told there, and how money and access and generosity are sometimes just the price of admission for control. Which brings me to the third wedding. Because this next mother didn't just want a moment, she wanted the entire night. By the time I got involved in Amelia and Logan's wedding, the money had already changed the temperature of the room. This one was Manhattan. Rooftop venue, glass walls, city lights stretching endlessly behind the skyline, the kind of place where everything feels expensive, even when nothing is happening yet. From the beginning, this wedding carried weight, not just financial, but social. Amelia knew it. Logan knew it. Everyone knew it. Logan's mother, Vivian Brooks, was not subtle about her resources. She didn't flaunt wealth in the loud, flashy way people expect. She did it through access, through names, through confidence that came from knowing doors opened when she knocked. When she offered to help with the wedding, she framed it as an investment in their future. "I want you to start your marriage without stress," she said. "Let me take care of the heavy parts." The heavy parts turned out to be most of it. Venue upgrades, catering enhancements, an expanded bar package, additional staff, a photographer with a reputation that came with a waiting list and a price tag to match. Every contribution arrived wrapped in reassurance. No pressure, just support. "I'm happy to do it." Amelia thanked her every time. Logan reassured her every time. And I watched closely because generosity that expansive always leaves fingerprints. Vivian was involved, not aggressively, but consistently. She wanted to be copied on emails. She asked to be informed of timelines. She framed her interest as curiosity, her authority as experience. "I've hosted events like this before," she told me casually during our first walkthrough. "I understand flow." Flow. That word stayed with me. The plan for the reception was intimate but refined. Cocktail-style seating, focus on conversation. The couple wanted to move freely, connect with guests, feel present instead of staged. Vivian agreed enthusiastically. "I love that," she said. Very modern, very you. On the wedding day, the rooftop buzzed with anticipation. Staff moved quickly, glassware caught the light. Music pulsed softly in the background. Amelia looked radiant but nervous, the kind of nervous that comes from wanting everything to feel meaningful. Vivian arrived early, earlier than anyone else. She greeted staff like colleagues, not guests. Shook hands. Used first names. Asked questions about timing, bar placement, lighting adjustments. No one stopped her. Why would they? She was paying for half of what surrounded us. I remember watching her stand near the bar, surveying the room with a small, satisfied smile, not emotional, evaluative. The ceremony passed without incident. Beautiful, clean, emotional in all the right ways. But during the transition to the reception, I noticed something shift. Vivian began pulling people aside, quietly, strategically. She introduced guests to one another, but not randomly. This is someone you should meet. You two would have a lot to talk about. I've been meaning to connect you. At first, it felt harmless, polite, social. Then, I realized who she was focusing on. Executives, investors, industry figures. People who recognized her immediately and responded with visible interest. And where was the couple? Logan was stopped mid-conversation twice because Vivian waved him over to greet someone important. Amelia waited, smiling politely, holding her drink as conversations dissolved around her. I caught her eye once. She raised her eyebrows slightly, a silent question. I shrugged, just as uncertain. Then Vivian took control of the microphone. Not dramatically, not officially. She simply asked the band to lower the volume, tapped the mic lightly, and began speaking to a cluster of guests near the center of the space. No announcement, no toast, just redirection. Servers adjusted their paths to accommodate her circle. The photographer drifted toward her group, instinctively following perceived importance. The bar staff prioritized the guests she gestured toward. The couple's first planned moment, a quiet thank you toast, dissolved without anyone explicitly canceling it. And that's when the realization hit me. This wasn't a wedding reception anymore. It was a showcase. Amelia stood near the edge of the crowd now, scanning the room like she was trying to locate her own event. Logan returned to her side, his expression confused, then slowly tight. "I feel like we disappeared," Amelia whispered. I felt a chill run through me, because she was right. Vivian hadn't hijacked the night loudly. She hadn't made a speech, she hadn't insulted anyone. She had simply redirected gravity. And watching guests orbit her instead of the couple, watching moments slip away unnoticed, I couldn't help thinking this was never about celebration. It was about positioning, and the night was just getting started. At first, Amelia tried to convince herself she was imagining things. That's what people do when something feels off at their own wedding. They assume it's nerves, overthinking, exhaustion. No one wants to believe their celebration is slipping away in real time. She leaned toward Logan and whispered that she felt strangely irrelevant. He frowned, scanned the room, and gave a half smile like he was trying to stay calm. "It's fine," he said quietly. "She's just being social." But even as he said it, another server brushed past them, carrying drinks straight toward Vivian's growing circle. Amelia took a slow breath and did what brides are taught to do when they feel overwhelmed. She tried to reclaim a moment. She stepped toward the bandleader and gently reminded him about their planned toast. Just a few words, nothing formal, just enough to recenter the room. He nodded, but hesitated. "I was told to hold off," he said carefully. "Told." Amelia's chest tightened. She asked who had told him. He didn't answer directly. He just glanced, briefly, toward Vivian. That glance said everything. I watched Amelia's face change, not dramatically, but in that quiet way that comes when confusion hardens into awareness. She walked back to Logan and told him what the bandleader had said. Logan's jaw clenched. This time, he moved. He approached his mother with a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and waited until there was a break in her conversation. Vivian turned toward him, surprised but composed. "Mom," he said, lowering his voice, "we were about to do a quick toast." Vivian blinked once, then laughed softly, placing a hand on his arm like she was soothing a child. "Oh, sweetheart. Now isn't the best time," she said. "Everyone's in such good conversations. Let's not interrupt the energy." The energy. Logan hesitated. He glanced back at Amelia, who stood a few steps behind him, watching closely. "We talked about this," he said. It was important to us. Vivian's expression shifted just slightly. The warmth cooled, the smile tightened. And this is important too, she replied. These people don't get together often. You don't want to waste the opportunity. At their wedding. I felt my stomach drop, because this was the boundary test in its clearest form, not shouted, not cruel, just positioned as practicality. Logan tried again, his voice firmer now. This isn't a networking event. Vivian's hand dropped from his arm. She looked around at the guests nearby, then back at her son, lowering her voice even more. I paid a lot of money to bring these people together, she said. It would be irresponsible not to make the most of it. There it was, not generosity, leverage. Amelia stepped forward then. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. Chen just said, I want to feel like this is our night. Vivian turned toward her slowly, eyes assessing, recalculating. It is your night, she said. And this is how nights like this work. Like this, as if there was a rule Amelia had failed to learn, as if her discomfort was simply inexperience. The silence between them stretched. Guests nearby pretended not to listen, while clearly listening to everything. Amelia felt exposed. Logan felt cornered, and Vivian felt justified. She smiled again, this time not warmly, but confidently. Trust me, she said. You'll thank me later. That sentence landed like a warning, because once someone believes they know better than you at your own wedding, the line between help and takeover disappears completely. And as Vivian turned away, already pulling another guest into her orbit, Amelia looked at me from across the room, eyes wide, searching, shocked. In that look was a question I've seen too many times. How do you take your wedding back? From the person who paid for it, and judging by the way Vivian had just doubled down, I knew the answer wasn't going to be gentle. After that exchange, Vivian didn't retreat. She accelerated. It was almost impressive how quickly she moved once the boundary had been tested and not fully enforced. Within minutes, she was everywhere at once, redirecting staff with subtle gestures, tightening the flow of the night around herself. The bar became her territory first. She instructed the bartender to prioritize certain guests, asking for specific bottles to be opened, name-dropping, as if the alcohol itself was part of the presentation. People noticed, heads turned, conversations migrated. Then it was the photographer. I watched as Vivian waved him over mid-shot, pulling him away from Amelia and Logan, just as they were laughing together with friends. She positioned him in front of a group of sharply dressed guests and said, "You'll want a photo of this." The photographer hesitated. I stepped in, reminding him the couple had priority. Vivian smiled at me. They'll get plenty, she said. This won't happen again. That sentence made my skin prickle. This won't happen again. Not the wedding, the networking, the connections. Servers followed the photographer. Guests followed the servers. The gravitational center of the room shifted again, this time unmistakably. Amelia stood frozen near the edge of the rooftop, her bouquet long gone, her posture tense. Logan paced once, then stopped, clearly realizing there was no clean way to interrupt what was now unfolding. Then Vivian took the microphone again. Not for a toast, for announcements. She began introducing people. Not by name alone, but by resume. This is someone you should know. They've just closed a major deal. You two have been circling the same circles for years. The band faded into background noise. The reception schedule dissolved completely. Guests leaned in, exchanging business cards pulled from suit pockets and clutch bags. At one point, Vivian laughed and said, "I love when everything comes together. Everything." As if the wedding were simply the setting. Amelia finally broke. Not outwardly, not dramatically. She turned to Logan and whispered, "I feel humiliated." That word hit harder than anger ever could. Humiliated. Because humiliation doesn't require insults. It comes from being erased. Logan nodded slowly, his face pale, eyes fixed on his mother as she held court under the city lights. "This is my fault," he said quietly. "I let this happen." Vivian overheard the tail end of that. She turned toward them, her expression tightening just enough to signal irritation. "Oh, don't be so serious," she said. "This is good for you. Good for you," as if their feelings were short-term noise compared to her long-term vision. Guests began to realize what was happening. Some looked uncomfortable, others leaned in enthusiastically, fully embracing the shift. The divide became visible: those who came to celebrate a marriage, and those who came to benefit from proximity to power. And standing there, watching Amelia's wedding disappear behind glasses, raised in professional interest, I felt a familiar mix of anger and helplessness. Because when someone uses money to bend an event this completely, the confrontation isn't just emotional, it's structural, and Vivian had designed this structure beautifully. As the night wore on, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a misunderstanding, this was the point, and the longer it continued, the clearer it became that if Amelia and Logan wanted this to stop, it would require a consequence Vivian hadn't anticipated. The question was whether they were ready to create one. As the evening stretched on, the air became thicker with tension, not the loud, obvious kind, but the kind that hums under the surface and pulses through every conversation. I could feel it as I watched the room fill with mingling. With the rise and fall of conversations happening under Vivian's ever-watchful eye, Logan and Amelia had retreated, their presence shrinking into the background of their own wedding, like invisible participants in an event that no longer felt like theirs. Every time they tried to move closer to a guest or engage with someone, it felt like they were met with polite but invisible barriers, the kind of social pressure that people don't realize is happening, but everyone feels. Vivian's grip tightened around the event like an iron fist wrapped in velvet. But not everyone was fooled. The first crack came when a vendor, one of the catering managers who had been hovering near Vivian's group all night, approached me quietly while she was distracted with another conversation. He leaned in, his voice low but urgent. "You need to do something," he said. "This isn't right." I didn't need to ask what he meant. He, like everyone else in the room, had noticed how smoothly the night was being steered away from the couple and toward Vivian's agenda. "She doesn't care who sees it," he added, glancing nervously around. "I've seen her do this before, but never like this." This wasn't just about the event itself. It was about an entire network of power and connections, a subtle but deliberate manipulation of social capital. Vivian was leveraging her wealth to transform the wedding into a business opportunity, and no one could ignore it anymore. I watched as a few guests who had been trying to engage with Logan and Amelia, sensing something was off, began subtly distancing themselves. Some moved to quieter areas of the venue, muttering under their breath about the dynamic of the night, while others who had tried to make small talk with the couple looked around, clearly rethinking their social positioning. The shift was gradual, but unmistakable. It wasn't the explicit drama of confrontation that caused the damage. It was the slow, quiet realization among the guests that this wasn't about love or celebration or even family anymore. It was about control, about dominance, about someone using a wedding to reshape the room in their image. Then came the moment when Vivian's empire cracked. She had just finished another impromptu round of introductions. Smoothly moving between clusters of guests, her voice growing louder with every name drop. As she turned toward the bar again, I noticed that Logan had finally snapped. He had seen enough. I watched him storm across the room, his jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with that mix of frustration and helplessness. He didn't speak loudly, he didn't shout, but every step he took was a clear, unmistakable message. This was the moment he was claiming back. He reached Vivian just as she was about to engage another high-profile guest, her hand outstretched, already in the middle of pulling someone into her orbit. "Mom," he said, cutting through the chatter like a sharp knife. "This is enough." The room fell into a brief, uncomfortable silence. Vivian turned toward him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her expression was one of surprise, yes, but also of calculation. As if she had expected this to happen, but was still confident she could recover from it. I'm just making sure everything's perfect for you, sweetheart, she said, her voice still warm, but with that sharp edge to it now. No, Logan replied, his voice firm, you're not. You've made it clear this is about you, not about us. For a moment, it looked like Vivian might try to smooth things over. She might retreat, apologize, back off. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, her expression changed. The facade of sweetness evaporated, replaced by something colder, more deliberate. "Oh, Logan," she said softly, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "This is how things work. You think I'm doing this for my own benefit? No, I'm doing this because I'm the only one who can make sure your little show doesn't fall apart." The words landed heavily in the room. I saw guests exchange glances, their discomfort growing palpable. The edge in Vivian's voice was unmistakable now. The mask of generosity had slipped completely. Everyone who had been silently observing realized what had been happening all along. This wasn't about love. It wasn't about family. It was about Vivian pulling the strings from the shadows, treating the wedding like a business transaction. Logan looked like he was fighting for control over his own emotions, but he didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He didn't need to. Instead, he looked at Amelia. Her face was tight, her body language closed off, but I could see the small flicker of recognition in her eyes. She wasn't going to back down. Neither was he. With a final glance at his mother, Logan stepped back. He grabbed Amelia's hand, pulled her gently away from the scene, and walked to a quieter corner of the rooftop. The message was clear. The night was theirs again, even if Vivian didn't know it yet. As they retreated, Vivian stood there, her jaw set, staring after them. For the first time that night, she looked like someone who realized that she had overplayed her hand. The social order she had so carefully constructed had shifted, not with a loud crash, but with a slow, deliberate shift of loyalty. The room had watched her play this game, and now they had seen the result. As Logan and Amelia stepped away from the chaos of their own wedding, something shifted in the air. It was subtle, but undeniable. As they moved to a quieter corner, the sounds of the reception began to fade behind them. The clinking of glasses, the laughter, the hum of conversations. The room was still alive, but it no longer felt like their world. Amelia's hand tightened around Logan's. She didn't speak immediately, neither of them did. For a moment, they simply stood there, side by side, watching the night continue without them. Watching their wedding transform into something they hadn't chosen. Logan looked at her, his face a mixture of frustration and helplessness. "I never thought it would be like this," he said quietly, his voice tight. "I didn't either," Amelia replied, her words soft but sharp with pain. "It feels like we're the ones being excluded." It wasn't anger that filled the space between them. It was grief. The kind that comes from realizing you've been a guest at your own event, while someone else has taken control of every moment that was supposed to belong to you. But Logan didn't let it linger long. He turned to face Amelia fully, his expression steady now, less uncertain. He wasn't the boy who had been manipulated by his mother's smile earlier. He wasn't the groom who had watched the most important day of his life slip between his fingers. "I'm not going to let her take this from us," he said firmly, the determination rising in his voice. "This is our day. She doesn't get to rewrite it." And in that moment, I saw the shift. I saw the couple I had first met weeks before, the ones who had been nervous, excited, but never fully aware of how much power their families held over them. Amelia and Logan were no longer the couple that had tried to appease everyone. They had found their voice, and they were reclaiming their wedding not with confrontation, but with quiet authority. Logan's next move was decisive. He walked back to the microphone, which had been abandoned on the stage. The room was still buzzing with the undercurrent of tension, but there was a weight to the moment now. As he took the mic and turned to face the guests, there was no grand speech. No dramatic gesture, just a quiet, confident statement. "Good evening, everyone," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "We'd like to thank you for being here with us tonight. This is our celebration, and we are grateful for each and every one of you who made it possible. It wasn't loud, it wasn't confrontational, but every word carried the weight of what had been silently stolen from them and what they were reclaiming. Amelia stepped forward beside him, and for the first time all night, the couple shared the spotlight. They spoke briefly, thanking their friends and family. They acknowledged the love and support they'd received. But it was the way they did it, standing together, claiming this moment as their own, that made the difference. Vivian watched from a distance, still standing near the bar, her jaw set, her eyes flicking between her son and the couple. She didn't say anything, she didn't need to, she knew exactly what this meant. This wasn't about who had paid for the wedding, it wasn't about who had the most connections. It was about who held the narrative, and in that quiet moment, Logan and Amelia were telling their story, not as the children of powerful parents, but as a couple who had made their own choice. As the night continued, Vivian quietly withdrew. She didn't leave, but she stopped engaging with the same force she had earlier. She began to fade into the background, her influence no longer as palpable. The wedding, the party, the night, it belonged to Amelia and Logan again. And by the time the final song played and the guests began to trickle out, the couple was standing together in the center of their celebration, not as victims of someone else's plans, but as partners who had found their own ground. The distance between them and Vivian was still there, still palpable. But it wasn't the defining element of their day anymore. What had started as a takeover had ended in a quiet victory. Amelia turned to Logan, her smile a little more genuine now, her eyes finally free of that weight they had carried all night. "We did it," she said softly, almost as if she were surprised by it herself. Logan nodded, pulling her close. "Yeah, we did." And in that moment, despite the manipulation, despite the power games, they had found something even more valuable than the wedding they had imagined. They had found each other. When that night finally ended and the rooftop lights dimmed, I stayed behind longer than usual. I always do after weddings like this. Because on paper, nothing catastrophic happened. The venue was stunning, the guests were fed, the music played, the photos looked expensive and flawless. But weddings aren't measured by logistics, they're measured by what people carry home with them. Amelia and Logan left that night closer to each other than when they arrived. That mattered. But they also left with a new understanding of what Vivian's generosity had really been, not a gift, but a transaction disguised as love. In the weeks that followed, I heard less and less about Vivian's involvement. Fewer calls, shorter messages, invitations declined with polite excuses, not punishment, not revenge, just recalibration. Because once you see someone turn your wedding into a stage for themselves, you don't unsee it, you don't argue it away, you don't negotiate it, you adjust access. And looking back at all three of these weddings, what stays with me isn't the drama itself, it's the pattern. The mother who rearranged a ceremony minutes before the bride walked. The mother who took a microphone and rewrote family history. The mother who turned a wedding into a business opportunity. Different women, different cities, different styles. Same sentence, I'm paying. I've learned that when that phrase is followed by respect, it can be a gift. But when it's followed by entitlement, it becomes a warning. Because money doesn't just buy flowers and venues. It buys silence. It buys hesitation. It buys the moment where someone thinks, maybe this isn't worth fighting right now. And that's usually when the boundary disappears. So if you've ever felt that tight feeling in your chest at a family event, that sense that something was taken without permission but no one could quite name it, you're not imagining it, and you're definitely not alone. If these stories felt familiar, I'd love to know which moment crossed the line for you. Not the loud ones, the quiet ones. The ones that made you pause and think, wait, that wasn't okay. Because at weddings, just like in families, the most revealing conflicts aren't the ones that explode. They're the ones everyone pretends didn't happen. And I promise you, I've seen many